Well, I'd actually like to start this afternoon by asking you a question. I'd like to ask you to think of the last time you were alone. And by alone, I don't mean by yourself in a room where there might be people in the room next door or across the hall or across the street. I mean the last time you were somewhere where you couldn't see another human being. Now, as you sit there thinking of that, it might be that you spent a day hiking and didn't see anyone. Maybe you spent a weekend alone in an isolated cottage in a remote part of the country. Perhaps you spent a week somewhere where you didn't see another living soul. But actually, when you start to think about it, it's very rare that we as human beings spend time beyond the reach of other human beings. Mankind, we're social animals. Well, on the 24th of November, 2011, I found myself alone. I stood on the Ross Ice Shelf and I watched this tiny little plane that had just dropped me off become a black blob in the sky, and then nothing but a faint buzz of engines, and then it disappeared completely. And on one side, I had a flat white horizon, a line between snow and sky. And on the other side, I had the distant peaks of the Transantarctic Mountains. And what struck me was that in that entire landscape, not only was I the only human being, I was quite probably the only form of life whatsoever. Because once you leave open water in Antarctica, there's no penguins, there are no birds, there was no moss, no trees, no grass, not even a bug or a fly. There's no life whatsoever. And faced with that situation, I fell back on my experience. I've spent 10 to 15 years putting expeditions together. I spent 3 years living on a research station in Antarctica. And so I had a routine that I knew very well. And I started putting up my tent, getting my equipment ready for the next day. But I realized something was wrong. I started falling over my own feet. I was being clumsy. I was getting things out in the wrong order. Then I noticed that I was breathing hard, as if I'd just run, and my heart was beating. And then I noticed that my hands were shaking. And I stopped and I thought, what is wrong with me? What's going on? And I realized this is what it feels like to be absolutely terrified. But it wasn't that I was scared of injury or of death. I was scared of the aloneness itself. And I'm someone who likes my own company. I deliberately seek it out on many occasions. And yet this was a whole new league of aloneness. And it really took me by surprise just how scared it made me to be alone. Ahead of me, I had a 2-month journey of just over 1,000 miles. And this is a map of Antarctica. And the little red blob at the bottom shows where the plane dropped me off. And the plan was that I'd ski up through the Transantarctic Mountains, which curve like an eyebrow across the top of the Ross Ice Shelf. And I'd ski to the South Pole, which sits in the middle of the continent, and then continue on to the far side to a place called Hercules Inlet on the Ronne Ice Shelf. Now, when I show people a map of Antarctica, I think it's really hard to get a true sense of the scale of the place. We're used to seeing Antarctica as this smear of white at the bottom of a world map. But it's actually twice the size of Australia, and yet it's empty. There's a smattering of scientists around the edges, but the population of Antarctica is never more than a few thousand. But I think it's really hard to grasp that until you're stood in the landscape of Antarctica, in the interior regions. And when you're stood in a landscape like this, that's when it really strikes you just how vast, how empty and how ancient this place is. And it's impossible to be stood there and not ponder on how tiny and vulnerable we are as human beings when faced with the true scale of nature on our own planet, never mind everything that lies beyond. And I think that's one of the things that makes Antarctica really special. But the other thing that's impossible, I think, to grasp from a map of Antarctica is that it's not flat. It's actually more dome-shaped in cross-section. So the edges are more or less at sea level, but the South Pole in the middle sits at about 3,000 meters. And parts of my journey went a bit higher than that. So what that means is that as you start climbing, it starts to get very cold very quickly. And it's not long before you start to look like this. At these sorts of temperatures, your breath freezes. So the humidity in your breath forms frost over all your clothing. And it's still pretty cool when you can take a picture of yourself looking like this because you feel like a proper polar explorer. But at these kind of temperatures, you can't have your skin exposed for any length of time. So you need to be covered all the time. So this face mask that you can see went on before I left the tent in the mornings, and it stayed on until I got back into the tent at the end of the day, because I couldn't have my skin exposed. But the reason I tell you this is because Antarctic expeditions are not about how big your muscles are and not about your physical fitness. It's more about what's going on in your head. It's a mental challenge first and foremost. I was completely alone throughout the expedition, but I did have a link to the outside world, and that was my satellite phone that you can see me holding here. And with that satellite phone, in theory, I could have rung anybody in the world that I wanted to at any time. But the interesting fact is that I chose not to. And it was because I felt emotionally incapable of summoning my loved one into the tent with me 1 minute and then pressing that disconnect button and sending them back thousands and thousands of miles away. I just felt that that sense of euphoria and then sense of aloneness would be too much to cope with in this fragile mental state that I found myself in. But I did use the satellite phone to send an SMS message every now and again. And this SMS message would appear as a tweet on my Twitter account. I couldn't access the internet. I couldn't see Twitter. I couldn't see the replies or the retweets. It was a purely one-way form of communication. But even though it was just me sending messages out, I found that an enormous source of comfort. It felt to know that somebody out there knew what was happening to me, made me feel just that little bit less alone. And that became really, really important. But the mental side of things became more and more important throughout the course of the expedition. And even though I love Antarctica, I've spent the last 15 years building up to this journey. This was a journey I wanted to make more than anything else in the world. Despite all that, every single morning, when I opened my eyes and inevitably heard the noise of the wind outside the tent, the very first thought that went through my mind was, I can't do this. And that wasn't me being overdramatic. That wasn't me being flippant. That was, I knew as a conviction with every fibre of my being that there was no way I could get out of the tent and face what I knew waited for me out there. I couldn't face the cold. I couldn't face having to break my food up into little bits and post it through my frozen face mask. I couldn't face having to expose my bottom to the cold every couple of hours to have a wee in the snow. I couldn't do any of that anymore. I knew that absolutely. And yet somehow I had to find a way to motivate myself to get out of that tent every single morning. And sometimes it wasn't pretty. Sometimes it involved tears and tantrums. Other times it involved promising myself an extra 5 minutes in my sleeping bag the next day, or eating some extra chocolate if I got out the tent. Sometimes it involved thinking about the people who'd helped me to get here in the first place, the people that I knew would be watching the website and waiting for this little dot to move from here to here to here to here. But perhaps it indicates the perversity of the human mind that my strongest source of motivation was not thinking of the people who'd supported me, but thinking of the people who'd been disparaging, the people who'd underestimated me, the people who said I wasn't going to make it. I didn't want those people to be right about me. And for them not to be right about me, I had to get out of that tent. And that was the thing that again and again and again drove me out of the tent. And so I realized really early on that the success or failure of my expedition was not going to be down to battling through heroic blizzards or leaping across open crevasses or dealing with horrendous frostbite and hacking off my own fingers. It was not going to be any of that. It was going to come down to the simple, fundamental, and yet incredibly difficult act of getting out of that tent every single day. That's what it boiled down to, just that, and that's what I had to focus on, getting out of that tent every day. But if you think that makes me sound a little bit crazy, then it's about to get a lot worse. Because as day 30-something turned into day 40-something, I started to have experiences that within the context of my expedition was absolutely fine. But when I got home and tried to describe those experiences to other people, I realized I sounded a bit loony. And it started with the sun. The sun never left. It was in the sky 24/7. It just made circles above my head all day, every day. And so it was pretty much the only permanent thing in my landscape. And so when I got up in the morning, I would say hello to the sun when I got out the tent. Get out the tent, hello, sun. And this developed over time to feeling that the sun was somehow protective and then comforting. So I'd get out the tent and say, oh, thank you for being here, sun. It's so amazing that you're in the sky. It's going to make the day so much better. Bit more time, and this evolved into skiing along, having full-on conversations with the sun in my head. And the crazy bit is the sun would reply. So I would hear the sun in my head. And some days the sun was comforting and protecting. Other days the sun was a bit of a diva. The sun would insist I was flattering its wonderful rays, the color of the sun, its position in the sky, telling it how wonderful it was. Other days, the sun would be a bit obnoxious and would say, Felicity, you're just whinging today. I've had enough of hearing you whinging. Just get on with it. So it wasn't always an easy character to live with. And I think a sign of how important this relationship with the sun became to me was the fact that when I got home, I didn't have a lot of after effects of being alone for so long. But one thing I did notice was that every day it was a sunny day and the sun was in the sky, I'd feel this irresistible urge to say good morning, to wave at the sun. And I realized you can't sit here talking to the sun. People are going to think you've gone mad. You do have a sense of what is appropriate behavior in public. And yet, when no one's looking, even to this day, I can't resist just having a little wave and a nod to the sun. Because in the first weeks when I got back and couldn't say hello to the sun, I felt terrible amounts of guilt. This was my friend, my loyal friend who had seen me through this really difficult journey. And now, all of a sudden, I was blanking my friend. I felt incredible feelings of guilt for weeks afterwards. But there was a practical reason why the sun was important to me, and that's because of these things. These things are called 𝗼𝗍𝗍, and they're formed by the wind literally gouging great troughs out of the ground and then redistributing that snow as these wind-blown formations. And sometimes they can be shin height, like this one. Other times they're waist height, shoulder height, or huge, great obstacles. And on a lovely sunny day like this one, you can see that 𝗼𝗍𝗍 really clearly and just ski around it, no problem. But most days, the weather looked more like this. This is when cloud has covered the sky, covered the sun, and all ground contrast has gone completely. So those 𝗼𝗍𝗍 I showed you are still there. It's just that now you can't see them. And so you can understand how trying to ski across this landscape when you can't see the obstacles underfoot can be really frustrating. You're constantly falling over things, tripping over things, and it felt to me like I was skiing in the dark. But just in case you're sitting there thinking, she's just left the lens cap on. She's just steamed up the lens. Well, I put my ski poles in the picture just to prove that this was the maximum visibility on most days. But when you're skiing in conditions like this, you can see that your eyes have nothing to focus on. There's no structure, no color. And when your brain doesn't have any data, it starts filling in the blanks for you. I'm talking about hallucinations, of course, and it didn't take me long before I started to see things that clearly weren't there. It started off with hands. I'd see disembodied hands pointing the way ahead or applauding in encouragement as I passed by. But I think perhaps one of the most disturbing hallucinations, I find it really difficult to understand why this occurred to my brain, was that one day I was skiing along and a little man appeared from behind an unseen 𝗼𝗍𝗍 and shook his fist at me in annoyance at having disturbed him from whatever he was doing behind the 𝗼𝗍𝗍. And then he jumped on a little mini triceratops and galloped off into the blizzard. But that was fine. I wasn't disturbed by that at all. That was just part of the course, my daily existence. But having told you that, nobody told me that you don't just hallucinate with your visual sense, you can hallucinate with your other senses as well. You can hallucinate sounds, for example, tastes even. And one day, I spent the whole day skiing along, being able to smell the aroma of freshly baked bread all day. And it was the only thing then I could think about was how much I wanted some hot bread with melted butter on it, which of course I couldn't have. But having told you all that, I think now you can understand why on day 56, when I saw some little grey blobs, I didn't really at first pay much attention. By now, I was used to little grey blobs appearing, disappearing, turning into dinosaurs, moving all over the place. But when I realised what it was I was looking at, I stopped in my ski tracks and burst into tears. Because what I was looking at was mountains, and the only mountains they could have been was the Transantarctic Mountains, the end of my journey. It might as well have been a big neon sign saying, "You have arrived." And I don't exaggerate when I tell you that that was the first moment I allowed myself to believe I had any possibility of reaching the far coast of Antarctica. And sure enough, 3 days later, I arrived at Hercules Inlet, at the coast of Antarctica. I was now the first woman in the world to have crossed Antarctica alone. I was the first person to have done so without using kites or machines. And yet, it was a bit of a sense of anticlimax. But I don't have to describe to you what it felt like, because I took out my camera and recorded my reaction as I arrived at the far coast of Antarctica. So there it is, Hercules Inlet and the runny ice shelf. The opposite side of Antarctica to the Ross Ice Shelf where I started. I got here about 20 minutes ago. I've just been sitting here ever since. I don't really know what I was expecting. Don't really know what it all after counting the days and the miles for so long, it all seems to have come to an end a bit quick. And now here I am, 1,700 kilometers, 14.5 degrees, 59 days later. I don't think I know yet what it all means or how I feel about it. And of course I'm pleased to be here, but right now I just feel really shell-shocked that it's over. That I'm done. That I'm on my way home. And the only thing I can think that I want right now is to ring my mum and to let her know that I'm here and that I'm okay, because I don't have to go anywhere now. The plane comes to me. Oh, I'm so silly. Oh, I can't believe it. I can't believe that I've skied across Antarctica. It's just too ridiculous. It's just far too silly. But now to make some phone calls. I know there's lots of people that want to know that I'm here. And I want to share it with them. Thanks very much. Well, the plane did eventually come to me, although it took it another 24 hours before the weather was good enough to fly in and get me. And as I saw that plane arrive in the distance, I expected to feel joy, triumph, relief, but in fact what I felt was a bit of panic that it was all over and I hadn't really worked out what it was all about yet. And yet I was aware that there was a tiny little voice in the back of my head saying, Felicity, you could have skied today. And then the question becomes, well, how far could I have skied? Could I have skied for another hour? Could I have skied for another day? Could I have skied another 100 kilometers, another 1,000? Could I have turned around and gone back to the other coast of Antarctica? And it's that curiosity, it's those questions to know how much further you have to push before you reach some kind of limit. That's the curiosity that I'm sure will see me going back to Antarctica. And it will keep me going and thinking of more ridiculous things to go and do until one day I find that I don't get out of that tent. And until then, I'm going to keep going back.